December 2, 1993. Los Olivos, Medellin, Colombia, 1:17 in the afternoon. The sun is hard and white on the orange clay rooftops. Pablo Escobar is barefoot, running. He moves in a plain white shirt, a pistol gripped in his right hand. One step behind him runs Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, the man every person in Medellin knows only as Limon, his last bodyguard, his last friend in the world. Below them, Colombian search block officers swarm every street in the neighborhood. They scale metal ladders against the exterior walls. They fire upward. Spent brass casings arc through the blue sky and ring against the concrete 3 stories below. 3 bullets find him, one in the leg, one in the torso, a final round behind his right ear. He drops. The man who once controlled 80% of the world's cocaine supply lies face down on an ordinary neighborhood rooftop in the city where he was born, 44 years old, barefoot, alone. The king of cocaine is dead, but the boy who became the king started with absolutely nothing. December 1st, 1949, Rio Negro, Antioquia, Colombia. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria came into the world in a small farming house in the highlands above Medellin. His father worked the land from before sunrise until after dark. His mother taught school in the local classroom. The house smelled of turned soil after rain. The family's poverty was not the soft, inconvenient kind. It was the kind that decided everything: what you ate, whether you ate, who you became. Pablo Escobar watched that poverty make every decision around him. He decided before he was a teenager that it would never make a single decision for him. By his mid-teens, he was moving through the graveyards of Rio Negro and Medellin after dark. He pried heavy marble tombstones from their resting places with his bare hands, hauled them into the back of a truck, and sanded off the engraved names of the dead before the sun came up. Then he sold the blank slabs to stonecutters who asked no questions. He graduated into car theft rings, moving through Medellin's back alleys, teaching himself which police officers could be bought and which ones to outrun. He learned one thing precisely from those early years: how underground markets work, and how to stay exactly one step ahead of the men assigned to shut them down. It was the only education he would ever need. In the early 1970s, he made his choice. He walked away from petty theft and stepped into the cocaine trade, not because it found him, but because he looked at what everyone around him was missing and saw it instantly. A massive American market was building for white powder. The supply chain was primitive. The profits were staggering, and the risk for someone willing to apply violence with the discipline of a military commander was completely manageable. He was never impulsive. He was never reckless. He was patient, systematic, and completely without mercy. That combination, in the Colombia of the 1970s, was worth more than any army. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Medellin cartel took shape around him, like a country within a country. Escobar was not the only man in Colombia's cocaine trade. He was the one willing to do what others hesitated to do: murder competitors in their own homes, bribe officials at every level, from street patrol officer to Supreme Court justice, and build a logistics operation of military precision. He constructed clandestine airstrips in the jungle. He developed submarine routes along the Pacific coast. He moved cocaine in bulk shipments disguised as legitimate cargo through ports his people controlled on both continents. By the mid-1980s, his organization supplied an estimated 80% of all cocaine consumed on Earth. The weekly revenue flowing through his network exceeded $400 million in cash. The money came in faster than his people could count it. Warehouses in Medellin and rural properties across Antioquia were stacked floor to ceiling with bundled bills. His accountants wrote off 10% of their total holdings every year. The reason, they wrote in the ledger, simply and without comment: rats. The rats were eating the money. His personal fortune reached somewhere between $25 and $30 billion, a figure so large it had ceased to function as a number and become something closer to a concept. In Medellin's hillside slums, the comunas, where families crowded into concrete rooms with no running water, he built a completely different image. He funded housing projects for thousands of families the government had abandoned for decades. He paid for streetlights in neighborhoods that had never had them. He walked through dirt streets on Sunday afternoons, handing out cash at local soccer matches, surrounded by children who knew his name the way they knew their own father's name. The neighborhood those families lived in is still called Barrio Pablo Escobar today. He was also, at that same moment, ordering murder on a systematic scale. Both things were completely true. Medellin held both truths at once and never found a way to resolve them. On November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203 lifted off from Bogotá's El Dorado Airport, carrying 107 passengers and crew. Escobar's men had placed a bomb inside the cabin. The target was a presidential candidate believed to be on board. The bomb detonated at cruising altitude over the town of Socha. The aircraft came apart in the sky. All 107 people aboard died in seconds. The falling wreckage killed 3 more on the ground below. 2 of the dead were American citizens. The attack turned the United States from a distant observer into a direct participant in the hunt for Pablo Escobar. From the late 1980s onward, Escobar's organization, operating under the name Los Extraditables, waged a systematic war against every Colombian institution that might send him to face justice in an American prison. Supreme Court justices were shot in their driveways on quiet Tuesday mornings. Government ministers were killed outside their offices in broad daylight. Police officers who refused cartel bribes were murdered in front of their families on their own doorsteps. The wail of ambulances became the permanent soundtrack of Bogotá. The city learned to flinch at backfiring engines. Exhausted and bleeding, the Colombian government did what governments do when the violence becomes genuinely unbearable. They made a deal with the man causing it. On June 19, 1991, Pablo Escobar walked through the heavy iron gates of La Catedral, a prison he had personally designed and personally funded on a cool, breezy hillside overlooking the city of Medellin. The guards inside answered to him. Visitors arrived and departed on his schedule. The facility contained a regulation soccer field. From inside its walls, he continued directing cocaine shipments to American cities and conducting cartel business as normal. He had negotiated his own comfort as the terms of his surrender. The Colombian government, desperate to stop the bombings, had accepted every condition he set. For 13 months, La Catedral operated as a fortress with a prison's name. Escobar hosted parties inside. He received business associates freely. He ordered the torture and execution of more than 20 rival cartel figures within those same walls, men whose bodies were found buried on the grounds when investigators eventually searched the property. By July 1992, the evidence of the internal murders had become impossible for the government to ignore publicly. Military trucks rolled up the mountain road. Soldiers arrived at the gates in the gray morning mist. They came to transfer Escobar to a genuine maximum security facility in Bogotá. He was already gone. He walked out through a hidden passage built into the prison's structure during its original construction, a back route the government never knew existed, designed by the prisoner himself before he ever set foot inside. He stepped into the green folds of the Andes Mountains. The largest manhunt in Colombian history began that same afternoon. Washington escalated immediately. U.S. Delta Force operators landed in Bogotá and began training an elite Colombian police unit rebuilt from the ground up, the Search Bloc. They brought close-quarters combat tactics the Colombians had never drilled before. The U.S. Army deployed a classified signals intelligence program called CentraSpike. Aircraft, that flew unannounced circuits over Colombian airspace, carrying technology capable of pinpointing a radio telephone transmission to within a single city block in real time. Every time Escobar keyed his radio to speak, those aircraft had a window to locate him precisely. He did not know the technology existed. Colonel Hugo Martínez took command of the search block in the autumn of 1992. Previous commanders had been hunted down and killed by cartel assassins. Escobar's organization had already delivered letter bombs addressed specifically to Martinez's home in Medellin, a message that required no translation. He read the threat. He handed temporary command to his deputy for 1 hour, walked outside the garrison into the street, and stood in the late afternoon air until his breathing slowed. Then, he came back inside, sat down at his desk, and never mentioned the letter again. In late 1992, Martínez made a decision that no operations manual would have permitted and that he never explained to anyone. He brought his own son, Lieutenant Hugo Martínez Jr., directly into the garrison and assigned him to the most sensitive phone intercept and signals tracking missions of the entire operation, not because it was safe, because the young man was the most technically skilled signals operator available to him, and Martínez had decided that winning the hunt mattered more than protecting himself from the worst possible outcome. Every morning through those 16 months, Colonel Martínez watched his son drive out through the garrison's steel gates into a city full of people who were paid to kill him. He watched, and every morning he sent him anyway. He never once said why. Before leaving Laredo, Texas, DEA agent Javier Peña sat across the kitchen table from his father. The older man looked at his son steadily and asked him not to go. Colombia, by late 1992, had a well-established reputation as a death sentence for American federal agents who went hunting cartel bosses. Several had not come back. Peña looked at his father. He shook his hand. He packed one bag and flew south anyway. He carried that conversation through every raid and every ambush for the next 3 years, without mentioning it once. DEA agent Steve Murphy arrived in Medellin and moved into the Carlos Holguin garrison with a single bag of personal items. On his first morning inside the fortified walls, he reached to the bottom of the bag and pulled out a small photograph of his 3-year-old daughter, taken in their backyard in Virginia. On a day he could still feel clearly if he sat still long enough. He pressed it against the bare concrete wall above his narrow cot with 2 strips of tape. That photograph became the fixed point of his entire life for the next 16 months. A $2 million bounty with his name on it hung over every move he made inside the city. He would not hold his daughter or sit in his own house in the Virginia evenings for well over a year. Every morning, before the day's briefings began, he looked at the photograph on the wall. He never complained, not once in 16 months. Murphy and Peña worked side by side with search block officers every single day, reviewing intercepts, planning raids, attending briefings in the same rooms, eating the same food from the same kitchen. When cartel ambushes killed Colombian officers, the 2 Americans stood in the rain at the gravesides alongside the men from the unit. They had long since ceased to be observers. They were part of the same organism. They coordinated raid after raid on safe houses across the city. They arrived each time to rooms that were still warm, a coffee cup left on the table, a radio still playing, boot marks on the tile floor leading to a back exit that had closed behind him 30 seconds earlier. His network of neighborhood lookouts warned him every time before the trucks even turned down his street. But the misses were getting closer. One afternoon, after a raid on a house in the Laureles neighborhood had produced nothing but a warm mattress and a half-eaten meal, Peña sat in the back of the truck on the ride back to the garrison and said nothing for the entire drive. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket and drew a single line through the address. Then he turned to the next page and began writing the next one. He had been drawing lines through addresses for 11 months. Running alongside the official hunt, a separate war had started in the dark. Enemies of Escobar, rival Cali cartel figures, vigilante factions, and families of his victims formed a death squad called Los Pepes. They operated with no official acknowledgement from any government. Their targets were the human infrastructure keeping Escobar alive and hidden: his lawyers, his accountants, his distant cousins, the mechanics who serviced his vehicles, the property managers who held his safe houses under borrowed names. The intelligence extracted before each killing reportedly flowed directly to Colonel Martínez's operations room. Bodies appeared on Medellin streets with notes attached. No government claimed to know anything about it. The notes kept appearing. By the late 1993, Escobar was moving constantly, sleeping in a different location every few nights, cycling through safe houses, narrowing down to a handful of trusted contacts. His billions were buried in fields across Colombia, inaccessible and useless to him. His wife, Maria Victoria, his son, Juan Pablo, and his daughter, Manuela, were trapped in a suite at Bogotá's Hotel Tequendama under around-the-clock surveillance. Every telephone line was tapped, every visitor logged, every movement tracked by joint search Bloc and DEA teams working through the night. They were not technically prisoners. They could not leave. They had become the most carefully monitored bait in Colombian history, and Escobar, isolated and increasingly desperate, kept calling them. The calls grew longer as the months wore on. Each extra second on the line was a second the Centra spike aircraft, circling high overhead, needed to lock his signal to a specific street address. His love for his family was quietly becoming the instrument of his destruction. In a freezing safe house somewhere in the mountains above the city, his daughter Manuela sat shivering beside him through a December night. The man who had once publicly offered to personally pay off Colombia's entire national debt looked at his cold child in the darkness. He turned to the bodyguard closest to him and gave a quiet order. They carried $2 million in bundled $100 bills into the center of the room. They stacked it on the floor. They lit it. The burning cash lit Manuela's face orange in the darkness. She stopped shivering. Her father watched her. He had $4 billion buried in fields he couldn't reach. He had $2 million on fire in front of him. He had his daughter's face in the firelight. He watched her until she was warm. December 1, 1993. Pablo Escobar turned 44 years old inside a modest two-story house on a quiet residential block in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. He celebrated with his mother, a cousin, and Limon. They shared a small meal under a dim overhead light. Escobar believed he had finally found a location secure enough to hold for several weeks. He had one day left. December 2, 1993. Early afternoon, Escobar picked up the radio telephone and dialed his son, Juan Pablo, at the Hotel Tequendama in Bogotá. He had lived by one absolute rule for the past 16 months: never stay on any call longer than 2 minutes. The rule had kept him alive through raids and near misses and the deaths of everyone around him. He broke it now without hesitation. He stayed on the line for 5 minutes and 47 seconds. He talked about the future. He gave his son advice, the kind of advice that sounds like a man who believes he will still be alive to see what happens next. He told Juan Pablo to look after his mother. He told him to be patient. He sounded, against all logic, almost calm. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog barked at nothing. High above the city, the trap closed. Centra spike operators locked onto the transmission before the call was half finished. The equipment traced the signal through the air to a specific house on a specific block in the Los Olivos neighborhood and held it there. The coordinates reached Colonel Martínez in Carlos Holguin Command Center within seconds. Lieutenant Hugo Martínez Jr., the colonel's son, was already in the signals aircraft when the lock came through. He had been tracking the transmission from the moment it started. He brought the bearing in clean. He knew what he had. He said nothing unnecessary. He read the coordinates twice. After 16 months of warm mattresses and empty safe houses, the ghost had a real street address. Martínez ordered every available officer into motion immediately. Nearly 500 search block officers deployed in silence across the neighborhood. They sealed every exit street without sirens. Snipers climbed in neighboring rooftops and settled their rifles into position in the white afternoon sun. Metal ladders went up quietly against the exterior walls of the target house. A resident watched through window blinds. His armed men in black quietly filled the street below. Inside, Escobar and Limón noticed nothing. The front door came in hard. Escobar and Limón ran for the upper floor without hesitating. They hit the back window at full speed and came through it onto the adjoining clay rooftops, bare tiles, orange in the afternoon heat, running away in every direction. Escobar had his pistol. Limón was one step behind him. Officers poured through the window behind them. They fired as they came. Limón turned. He raised his weapon and put himself between his boss and the incoming rounds. A volley of fire struck him across the chest. Álvaro de Jesus Agudelo collapsed onto the sun-baked clay tiles. He died on that rooftop, still facing the men who were coming. He had chosen never to leave Pablo Escobar's side. He never did. Escobar did not look back. He ran, barefoot, bleeding from wounds in his leg and torso, firing behind him as officers closed in from every direction. The man who commanded billions of dollars and an army of professional killers fought his last fight completely alone on an ordinary rooftop in his own city. Below him, search block officers gripped the metal rungs of the exterior ladders and climbed toward the roofline under direct gunfire. They had trained for this exact moment through 16 months of failed raids and early morning funerals. They climbed through the fire without stopping. At approximately 1:20 p.m., a single bullet crossed the rooftop. It struck Pablo Escobar behind his right ear. He dropped instantly, his face pressed into the hot clay. His right arm stretched out across the tiles, the pistol resting open beside his hand, his fingers loose. Officers reached the roof within seconds and approached with weapons raised until there was nothing left to approach. Then they confirmed the body, and they stood in the afternoon sun in the quiet that followed, and nobody said anything for a long time. The Cocaine King was dead at 44 on a rooftop in the city where he was born. In early 1994, Steve Murphy boarded a flight home to Virginia. He walked through his front door. His daughter was waiting on the other side. She was nearly 4 years old now, larger than the photograph he had pressed to the garrison wall 16 months earlier, bigger in every way than the frozen image he had looked at every single day before the day's work began. He picked her up, he held her against his chest and said nothing. He just stood in his own hallway and held her. The mission had cost him things he was never going to fully name, not to her and not to anyone. From December 1993 onward, official Colombian police reports credited a search block sergeant with the fatal shot behind Escobar's right ear during the rooftop chase. Escobar's widow and his son Juan Pablo maintained from the day he died that he placed his own pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger, rather than be taken alive and transported in chains to an American prison cell. He had said as much, in those exact words, years before the end. Ballistic reports have never definitively resolved the question. The rooftop mystery endures more than 30 years later. It probably always will. Within weeks of his death, the rival Cali cartel quietly absorbed the major cocaine routes to the United States. They were disciplined, corporate, and deliberately invisible. Everything the Medellin operation had refused to be. The global cocaine trade did not slow for a single day. It simply changed management. In December 1993, 25,000 people packed the streets of Medellin for Pablo Escobar's funeral. They came from the barrios where he had built housing and funded soccer pitches and walked through the streets handing out cash to strangers. They mourned with genuine grief the same man who had filled their city with car bombs and buried their neighbors and turned their sons into killers and their daughters into widows. Both things were entirely true. He left Colombia, a country that still has not decided what he was, monster or myth, villain or victim of the history that made him. He left a rooftop. He left a question, and the war he fed with his empire never ended on those tiles with him. If this story stayed with you, there are 50 more just like it that never made the evening news. Subscribe. We find them every week.